Hello, and welcome back to my series of videos where we create the Pomodoro Clock from freeCodeCamp. In this video, we'll fix some broken tests, and I'll update you on some other broken tests that I'm trying to fix on the freeCodeCamp side. Next, we'll style our code with TailwindCSS, a new CSS utility library that makes styling React super easy. Huge thanks to everyone out there keeping me going, saying nice things, and genuinely making me feel welcome here as a YouTube contributor. Thanks a bunch. And if you haven't already, press that subscribe button, press that like button, come follow me on Twitter, and come follow me on dev.to. I'd love to hear from all of you. At our terminal, the first thing we want to do is start our server. So go ahead and run npm run start or yarn start. And this is exactly where we left off. Let's quickly jump into some code and fix some mistakes I made in the previous video. Now here in our code, we have a few bugs to fix. In our decrementer, we get a new break length. Now let's only call that set break length function if the new break length is greater than 0. That makes a lot more sense logically and will avoid this set break length to 0, which is a no-go for freeCodeCamp tests. So if new break length is greater than 0, let's set the new break length to new break length, and we can delete the code down here. And very similarly for this decrementer here, if the new session length is greater than 0, we can set this new session length inside of there. Delete the rest of that code. We also want to fix the incrementers. According to the freeCodeCamp test suite, the incrementers should not be allowed to go over 60. The break or the session cannot go over 60. So let's have a new break length variable equal to break length plus 60. And only call the set break length if the new break length is less than or equal to 60 times 60, because we are allowed to go to 260, but we cannot go above 60. Very similarly for the set session length, increment session length by 1 minute here, let's have a new session length variable equal session length plus 60. And if the new session length is less than or equal to 60 times 60, then let's call the set session length inside of there. Oh, I have a mistake here. Now let's scroll on down to our handle start stop click function. I notice here we have a new time left, which is equal to prev time left minus 1. So we can actually replace this with new time left. And down here, instead of calling set time left again, please remember that we're already in a set time left function. We'd be just recalling it. Let's just return the break length, and this will return it to the set time left and set the time left to whatever the return value is. So up here, set time left is set to new time left. Down here, time left will be set to break length. And down here, we want to set the time left to session length. Those are all the bugs I found in app.js. Now in session.jsx and break.jsx, one of my YouTube followers found out that the minutes function in this moment.duration actually has a bug, and it's best to use as minutes. This led to some crazy code in the freeCodeCamp test suite that was really hard to spot. So, thank you. Now let's go on over to the browser and see if we broke anything or start passing some tests. In our browser, let's run the tests. And let's open up the tests that we just ran. Tests number 8 is a broken test in the freeCodeCamp test suite. I actually submitted a pull request to try and fix this bug in the freeCodeCamp test suite. So if you get a chance, go ahead and look at that pull request. I'll link it in the description below. Now that same bug is actually affecting these two tests down here, and let me explain exactly what's happening. The timer, our timer, actually does reach 0, and it actually does switch to break and does switch to session whenever they reach 0. However, let's go to app.js. You'll see that we call set current session type, making them break and session. This function actually takes some time for the app to re-render, and unfortunately the freeCodeCamp test suite does not wait for our app to re-render. Therefore, without having the test wait, the test will definitely break. I'll go ahead and make pull requests to fix those after my first pull request is accepted. With that, we passed all the tests that we can pass until I go ahead and fix the freeCodeCamp test suite. Now let's get into some styling with Tailwind CSS. Before we install Tailwind CSS, let's talk about what Tailwind CSS actually is. It's a utility-first CSS framework. What that means is that it doesn't give you the usual components, the usual forms, the usual buttons right out of the box. Instead, it gives you a bunch of classes you can use to create the components yourself. For instance, this component on the right is using this code up here. It has large text, purple text, the height is 16, width 16, etc., etc. So this card isn't really out of the box, but you can make it using the utilities that Tailwind CSS provides us. Back in our code, let's start by installing Tailwind CSS. Tailwind CSS will be a dev dependency, so you can run npm install tailwind css, post css cli, and auto prefixer -d, and that will save it to the dev dependencies. The next thing we'll want to do is initialize Tailwind CSS, so let's run npx tailwind init tailwind.js --full. What that'll do is create a tailwind.js file in the root of your directory with all the configuration necessary for tailwind.css. Now we'll be using PostCSS, which is a tool that transforms styles with JS plugins. It allows us to lin our CSS, support variables and mixins, and transpile future CSS syntax, inline images, and more. Let's create a new file called css.config.js. In this file, we'll import remember, this is basically just a JS file, so let's import Tailwind CSS from tailwind.css and module.exports, plugins, Tailwind CSS, and require auto prefixer. Just like that. Now, you may be wondering, where is he getting all this from? How does he know how to code all this? Basically, if you go to Tailwind CSS here, you'll have all the answers in the Get Started section. You'll see everything I did in the post css.config.js file is in the Get Started section of Tailwind CSS. I'm not some kind of genius. I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm just copying and pasting from the Tailwind CSS documentation. Alright, and the next thing we want to do is in our source folder, we'll create an assets folder and a tailwind.css file. In this file, we'll import all the base styles and configurations. Now with all this in the tailwind.css, you'll notice that, well, this isn't really CSS. What we need to do is have post CSS take all this and generate actual CSS for us. We'll do that in our package.json right before we run start, the start command. So let's create a watch CSS script which basically transpiles the Tailwind CSS file that we have here and outputs a main.css that is actually CSS. Now we want to do that right before we start our application, so we can do that here. You will probably do npm run watch CSS. Since I use yarn, I'll use yarn watch CSS. Now let me show you what that does. So we'll run yarn start, and you'll see in our assets folder, we now have auto-generated main.css, which is the tailwind.css library. This file is absolutely humongous. Do not go and try to go through it. What you'll want to do if you have VS Code is go ahead and install the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense extension, and this makes it really easy to go ahead and dig into Tailwind.css and understand exactly what they have to offer. Now, in our app.js, let's go ahead and import the main.css file from our assets folder, and that'll import all the tailwind.css that we have while removing all the css.createReactApp and that our browser gives us. Because remember, we're normalizing the CSS, which basically means we're not using the browser provided CSS. It's all up to us. Now, remember we installed the Tailwind CSS extension for VS Code. Right now, it's not working. I'm pressing Control Space and nothing's coming up. So what I'll need to do is reload the window, basically restart your VS Code. And you'll see now when you press Control Space, you'll have a bunch of options to use in your class name along with the color that may be associated with that class. Let's go ahead and look at the Tailwind CSS documentation really quickly. You'll see that there is a flexbox available for us to use in Tailwind CSS. We have flex direction for us to use, which comes in flex row, flex column, and we also have, let's say, height for us to use. We'll be using h full for height 100%. There's also h screen, h40, h56, a bunch of different heights for us to play with. Now what this means is that each class name in Tailwind CSS just adds a small little property to our HTML element. And I also want to point out that Flexbox is something that you should know in CSS before going into, let's say, React. You should really understand exactly what Flexbox is because it's an important concept in CSS. In our parent container, we'll be adding Flexbox, flex column, h screen to make it 100%. Let's actually make it let's make it h screen, items center, and this will center it horizontally, and justify center, which will center it vertically. So here we have our entire application centered. Now let's add a background color. To add a background color, we'll just type in class name bg hyphen, and you'll see our Tailwind CSS extension provides all these colors for us. Let's give one a try. Let's say background blue 800, save it, and our background changes to blue. It's that easy. Tailwind CSS really makes it super easy to modify your CSS. For this video, we'll use BG Green 700. However, at this point, I do want you to break away from the video and figure out what you want for your application, how you want your application to look like. Go ahead and play with some Tailwind CSS. Now, to make this application look right, I'm going to actually place a div around our break, our time left, and our session. Inside of this div, I'll add a class name of flex, and let's see what that looks like. You'll see that now they're in a row, but they're all bunched together. I want the width to go the full width of the screen, and I want everything here to not be at flex start, but to have some space around them. So I use the justify around class name, which is short for justify content space around. Now, if I'm losing you here, it may be because you don't understand Flexbox very well. Please go through and study that. It's super duper important. What I want to do is start with the plus and minus buttons for the break and session components. In my source folder, I'm actually going to create a UI folder, and I'm going to create a file called break session UI.js. Now, why am I doing this, you wonder? Basically, you'll see if you go into break and session, the HTML is basically identical. They look exactly the same. So what we need to do is create components to encapsulate the CSS, the Tailwind CSS that we write. That way we only write it once. We're not going back and forth from break and session to write the CSS twice. The first thing I want to write is the container here for break and session. So let's go into break session UI and create. First we'll import React. From React, we'll export a const called break session container. And this will take a prop called children, and will also allow for other props to be passed in. Now from here, let's return a div, and here we'll pass the children between the div, and this class name will have a flex column, and items into center here, and we'll also pass the div the rest of the props. So let's take this break session container, and in both session and break, we'll replace this div with break session container. And don't forget to import it at the top of your file, like so. Let's save and see what that looks like. Not much has changed. You'll see the minus and plus sign are now vertical, but we'll fix that in a bit. The next thing I want to style is this label here, the break label and the session label. So in our break session UI, let's export another component called break session label. And this will take in the same props as the last one, and we'll return a paragraph with the class name text large. Let's take this break session label and replace this paragraph tag here in session.jsx, and don't forget to import it, and in break.jsx. Now let's go back to our application. You'll see not much has changed. The session and break have both gotten a little bigger. Let's go back. I do want to give this break session label some color. Let's say text green 200 for my purposes, but again, you please do whatever you find to be the most stylish. And you'll see here that we changed break and session to those two light colors. Now I want to change this 5 here and this 25, which corresponds to this p tag here in session and this p tag here in break. In break session UI, let's export const break session time, children, props, and again this is the rest of the props, like the IDs that we pass into our paragraphs. So this will be a paragraph with the class name text 4 extra large, font bold, and text white. And again, I do want to remind you that all of these class names can be found in the Tailwind CSS documentation. For instance, you'll see text color, it's all here. Text orange, here's the text white that we used, etc., etc. Anyway, back in our application, let's not forget to pass in the props to this paragraph. And take this component name and replace the paragraph tag with it, not forgetting to import break session time in both of these files. Now let's save, and you'll see now that we have a big old number, 525, and it works. Our plus and minus buttons do not look too great. So let's fix this vertical thing that's going on, the vertical minus and the vertical plus. And to do that, we'll need to actually wrap this here in a container. So let's make that container here in break session UI.js. Export const plus minus button container. We'll turn a div with the class names of grid, and this comes from CSS Grid. Let's actually wrap this like so, and let's not forget to import. And same here, we'll wrap this, and let's not forget to import. And you'll see now that our negative and our plus signs are horizontal. Now let's make these buttons nice and pretty. Here, I'll create a component called plus minus button, and just as before, we'll pass in the children and props. We'll return a button, and this class name for mine will be margin top. This MT is for margin, the M is for margin, so you can say margin all around. MB is for margin bottom, ML is for margin left. You could do MR for margin right, but I'll do margin top of 2, text large, text gray 800, PX, which is the horizontal padding, the padding left and the padding right. You could also do PY, which is the top and bottom padding, PB, which is bottom padding, PT, PR, which is the right padding, PL, which is the left padding. All these class names out of the box to help you out and quickly style your components. So PX4, PY2, which is the vertical padding, BG green 200. For me, again, please style this the way you want, and we'll have rounded corners, which gives us a border radius of 0.025 rem. That looks good. Let's not forget to pass our props to our button here and our div here. Looks like I forgot to do that. And now let's take a look at our buttons. Whoops, got to take this and replace it in our components. Right, now look at our buttons. They look a ton better than they did before. Very nicely done. However, of course, our session in the middle looks a tad bit sad, a tad bit boring. Let's go ahead and fix that. Let's open our time left component, and instead of extracting this into the UI folder, notice that this doesn't have any shared components between two files. There's no need to make a central file to house all these class names. So let's just do it directly in this file. So for the container class, let's add some flex. It'll be flex column, justify evenly, item center. And again, I'm cheating because I already did this exercise, so I know exactly what to do. BG red 600 and rounded full. That'll make it kind of a circle, a round circle. Looks like a tomato, right? Like a pomodoro a little bit, maybe. And again, I would go ahead, go back and play with this a little bit to make it yours. Play with these class names. For the p tag inside, let's make a class name, text red 900, text 2XL. Our session title looks exactly the way I want it to. Now for this time left, I find like this is the most important part of the application, and I want to make it extra special. So I'm going to call on a Google font, and I found a font called Orbitron, but of course you find fonts that make you happy. And I'm going to use this font here. So I selected the font. I'm going to also customize it. I know that I will want to use the bold variant of this font. And now with this customized, I can copy this link href, go into our index.html, and paste it to download the font. Now at the same time, I do need to tell Tailwind.js that I'm going to use this font. So I'll go down to Font Family, create a new font family called, let's say, Clock, and inside this array, I'm going to write Orbitron, which will use the Orbitron font that we just added to our application. So now I can use font-clock to get this Orbitron font. So let's try that out. First, let's go back to our terminal, restart the server. That way we get all the new CSS, all that new Orbitron goodness into our application. And here at time left, let's add class name, font, and you'll see font clock actually comes up in the autocomplete in the VS Code extension, which is amazing. Text for Excel and font bold. Let's take a look, see what that looks like, and you'll see that our time is big and bold there in the middle. I think that looks amazing. Now for our start button, let's add a class name here, and I want it text red 400, font semi-bold. The background will be green 900, and px4, py2, and rounded large. Let's see what that looks like. That button looks great. Now, here, this reset button is a little out of place outside of this tomato. It almost feels like this reset button should really be inside of this makeshift tomato here. So, let's go back to our app.js where we have this reset button. And you'll notice that I need this handle reset button click function passed to time left. So I am going to copy this here and pass it to our time left component, cut this reset button, put it inside of our time left component after the start button, and you'll see that we don't have a handle reset button click. That's because we need to pass it in as props into time left. Great, so now our reset button is inside this component. Does it work? Yes, it does. But it's not styled. Also, it's vertical. We may or may not want it to be vertical. Let's take a look. So class name is border 2, text green 900, rounded, border green 900, border solid, and px4, py2. See what that looks like? That looks okay. That doesn't look horrible. Let's see what rounded large looks like. That looks pretty good. I, for one, kind of like the verticalness here of this reset button. However, I do think the horizontal padding is a bit too big. Let's bring it down to 3. See what that looks like. Boom. That looks really, really good. If we wanted to make it vertical, we would simply surround these two buttons with a div and give this div a class name of grid flow column, and gap 2. There we go, the grid flow, and here we have horizontal buttons. But to be honest, I changed my mind. I kind of like the vertical buttons. Looks kind of crazy, but whatever. So this here is how I chose to style my Pomodoro Clock application. I actually implore that you do not style it this way. I want you to go ahead and make crazy styles, play with TailwindCSS, change some numbers here and there, change some colors, change this to bold, etc., etc. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really hope you enjoyed this introduction to Tailwind CSS. I do think it's a very important part of web development. Styling is probably the most important part, and Tailwind CSS makes it so you can style your web applications super duper quickly. So don't forget to click that subscribe button, click that like button, and leave me some comments. Until next time, peace.